Great. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have an hour that's chock full of content, so we don't want to delay the start at all. Welcome to today's webinar, Winning Results for the Planet, Shareholder Season 2026. My name is Gigi Norcross, Vice President of Business Development for Green Century, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of experts who will walk through our shareholder advocacy season, inclusive of issue area expertise around two of Green Century's priority campaigns. Before I introduce our speakers, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First is the agenda, as I mentioned, is chock full of content, but we will leave time for questions at the end. I certainly encourage you to pose your questions in the chat during the course of the webinar, as we will answer some of them in the chat, and then we will also save time at the end for answering some of your questions live. So use the chat, use it throughout the course of the webinar. And then secondly, we'll make our presentation deck available today. The presentation slides that we're going through, we'll make that available to everyone. So by all means, take notes, but you can also know that you'll be receiving the resources that are inherent in the slides as a follow-up to today's webinar. Okay, so now to introduce our panelists. First, Annie Sanders. Annie is Green Century's Director of Shareholder Advocacy. She's based in Denver, and she's going to walk us through our wins today and some of the specifics around the companies that we engaged and the results that came from those engagements. Then we have Celeste Mayfrin-Swango, who is joining us today as an issue area expert on the issue of reducing plastic pollution, which is one of Green Century's priority campaigns. Celeste is the Beyond Plastics Director for Environment America and based in Portland, Oregon. And then finally, we have Johanna Newman. Johanna is joining us today as an issue area expert on the topic of renewable energy. Johanna is the senior director for the 100% Renewables campaign, also from Environment America. And Johanna is joining us today from Amherst, Massachusetts. We'll end this session today with a release of our impact report from this year's shareholder advocacy season. So we'll get to that at the end. We can move on to the next slide. Before I turn things over to Annie, just a couple of notes on Green Century. A leader in sustainable investing since 1991. We are celebrating our 35th anniversary this year, something that we're super proud about. And we offer three mutual funds. Those three mutual funds are the ones that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. We boil down our approach to three parts. The first is environmentally responsible mutual funds. We screen out the industries that are most harmful to the planet, starting with fossil fuels. Secondly, we run a robust shareholder advocacy program that results in better for the planet business practices from companies that we engage. And then finally, we are unique in that we are entirely owned by nonprofit organizations. So the net profits that are generated from the management of our funds goes to those organizations to fund their critical campaigns. So those are our three parts. We're going to focus entirely on part number 2 today, the advocacy part. So on that note, I will turn the mic over to our Director of Shareholder Advocacy, Annie Sanders.
Great. Thanks, Gigi, and nice to be here with you all. Thanks so much for joining us. So as Gigi said, I'm the Director of Shareholder Advocacy. That means my job is to lead our team that works directly with companies to negotiate commitments that improve their environmental policies in order to achieve real-world measurable change for our planet. And, the advocacy, I think, is one of the biggest areas where we stand out. We engage in shareholder advocacy in 4 key ways. So we do proxy voting, obviously. So we vote our 600 plus proxies in-house according to our sustainability guidelines. And then company engagement. We meet with corporate executives from companies across sectors, from big retailers to semiconductors to transportation companies to quick service restaurants and more, to analyze material sustainability risks. For our dialogues with companies, we always come prepared with a set of questions about the financial risks associated with, say, exposure to climate change or deforestation, plastic pollution, et cetera. And then we determine throughout that conversation if we feel the company has policies in place that position it to adequately mitigate those risks. So, for example, do they have science-aligned climate emissions reduction targets and a plan to hit them? Do they have robust forest protection policies to make sure that their suppliers providing them with commodities like beef, soy, palm oil, and timber pulp and paper, which are, by the way, the four biggest drivers of global deforestation, aren't destroying rainforests to source those commodities? Do they have a plan to measure and to cut their plastic use? So that's the engagement piece. And then advocacy. So it's not enough just to ask questions about those risks and those issues. We then press companies to change their policies accordingly. So after dialogue, if we determine that a company, though, is adequately mitigating those risks, we'll say, great, we'll move on. If not, though, we'll obviously press in the dialogue and ask them to improve their policies, but oftentimes it takes filing a shareholder proposal to get the company to the negotiating table. We'll typically end up withdrawing about half of the shareholder proposals that we file in exchange for a commitment from the company to address the environmental risks that we've raised. And then, but the other half go to a vote at the company's annual general meeting before all of their investors, and so everyone has a chance to vote on the question. Then the fourth item here I'll just cover briefly, which is outcomes that deliver impact. It's not enough just to say, okay, great, thanks company X for committing to improve your policies. See you later. We follow up, we track, we make sure the company actually follows through, and we certainly follow up if it seems like they are not on track. So next slide, please. This proxy season, we engaged 81 companies. So not just sent a letter to, but that means had a substantive dialogue with at least, if not filed a shareholder proposal or went to their meeting. We engaged 81 companies in a substantive way across 7 issue areas. We filed 29 shareholder proposals, maybe 30 by the end of the day today, so stay tuned. And we have won so far 15 new policy changes. This is more engagements than last year. I think we had about 64 engagements last year, about the same number of filings, but more proposals this year. We were able to withdraw in exchange for a commitment from the company to improve their policies. So 15 this year versus about 10 last year. And then I'd say this has largely been the trend this year for other investors who also file a lot of shareholder proposals. Companies have been this year more interested in coming to the table to find an agreement to negotiate a withdrawal rather than sort of the ballot or engage in a protracted fight. And we think that's due to a number of reasons, but in part the sort of fraught political climate and also some recent changes at the SEC. So with that, as a scene setter, I'm gonna turn it over to Celeste. So what we're gonna do on this call is bring on some campaign experts, as Gigi mentioned, who really know their stuff on plastics and climate change. They'll go through the problems and solutions on those issues and what they're doing about it, and then I'll share what Green Century has accomplished this year on each of those issues, which is all made possible by our amazing investors in Green Century funds. So Celeste Mayfran-Swango, again, the Beyond Plastics Campaign Director, Environment America, will take it away to talk about plastics.
Thanks so much, Annie. And thanks so much to Green Century for inviting me to speak today about plastic pollution, its impact on the environment, and what we can do about it. So yes, I'm Celeste Mayfran-Swango, Beyond Plastics Campaigns Director with Environment America, which is a national network of 29 state environmental groups that tackle the most profound problem of our time, which is a way of living that is destroying the natural world. So I wanted to take a moment to outline the problem of plastic pollution, some of our proposed solutions, and share a recent report that we did about one, I believe, particularly egregious use of plastic. So next slide. So just to set the stage here, there is simply no escape from plastic these days. Our economy encourages us to make, use, and toss at the greatest possible speed. And often we just don't think twice about getting our coffee to go in a plastic foam or plastic cup with a plastic straw, or food in a foam or plastic takeout container. And then when we're done with these single-use plastics, usually after just a few minutes of use, we throw them away. And as a result, the US creates more plastic waste than any other country in the world. We generate enough plastic waste to fill the Cowboys Stadium, which is the largest professional football stadium in the country, every 16 hours. So then where does all of this plastic go? You can go to the next slide. Only a very small percentage of plastic gets recycled, so less than 10%. About 12% gets incinerated, which is bad for public health and bad for our climate. And the rest, about 79%, either ends up in a landfill or in other parts of our natural environment. And this is a huge problem because plastic as a material does not break down easily in the environment, persisting for hundreds of years at least, could be longer, often breaking into smaller fragments like microplastics and nanoplastics. As a result, plastics have been found nearly everywhere we've looked, from the deepest trenches of the ocean to the top of Mount Everest and everywhere in between. Next slide. Plastics are especially devastating to the world's oceans and wildlife. According to the United Nations, at least 800 species worldwide are affected by marine debris, and as much as 80% of that litter is plastic. Plastic fragments have been found in every single species of sea turtle and almost half of all marine bird and mammal species. Next slide. A big culprit here is single-use plastic, which is the vast majority of what we find as pollution, especially foodware and packaging. I think we'd all agree that nothing that we use for 5 minutes should pollute the environment for hundreds of years, but that's exactly what's happening. We produce 300 million tons of plastic every year worldwide, half of which is for single-use items. Next slide. Plastic's damaging effects are felt everywhere that it persists, in our oceans, rivers, on land, in the atmosphere, and even in our own bodies. Next slide. We now know that micro and nanoplastic is showing up in the things that we eat and drink, so water, honey, beer, seafood, etc. It feels like reports are coming out every week showing that microplastics have been found everywhere in the environment and in our bodies. The health effects of all of this exposure to microplastics aren't fully known, but plastics are made from fossil fuels and they contain harmful chemicals like carcinogens and endocrine disruptors. And despite what the petrochemical may have you believe, nearly all of our plastic stuff is not actually easily recyclable, not economically and not technically at the moment, which leads us to one basic solution, which is reduction. Next slide. If your bathtub was overflowing, the first thing that you would do is turn off the tap. And we know that in order to solve the plastic problem, we have to turn off the tap. And that means addressing it at the source by not making so much single-use plastic stuff in the first place. So we need to reduce and replace our single-use plastic products with less harmful and reusable alternatives. Next slide. So we have three basic strategies that we're employing to reduce plastic. First, we just have to limit the amount of disposable plastic products that are handed to consumers every day and stop producing unnecessary plastic items that are easily replaceable with sustainable alternatives. So these are the items that tend to pollute the most since they're used for just a short time before being thrown away. So think plastic grocery bags, polystyrene foam takeout containers, plastic straws and utensils, plastic air pillows, and more. Second, we think we need to shift away from single-use products altogether, even the non-plastic ones, where we can, and instead use reusables and refillables. And part of our program is figuring out ways to encourage businesses to use reusables and refillables, especially for food and beverage containers, since that's where so much single-use plastic waste is happening. And the third strategy here is producer responsibility. So producer responsibility is the idea that the producers of plastic packaging should take financial responsibility for the full life cycle of their products. And producer responsibility programs work because they change the incentives that make wastefulness so cheap. When manufacturers are held responsible for their products at the end of their lives, they tend to make different choices when designing those products in the first place, making them more reusable, repairable, recyclable, and resilient. Most of our work to reduce plastic pollution is happening in the States, but we have also been working on the national level, targeting major companies, asking them to do what they can to reduce plastic waste by implementing one of these strategies. So I wanted to share a little bit about a recent report that Environment America Research and Policy Center did that highlights one of the ways that companies can take action. So yeah, in April, we released a report called Plastic in the Produce Aisle. This report is based on the frustrating experience many of us have had in recent years when we're shopping for fruits and vegetables, only to find that they're packaged in plastic. So lemons in plastic film bags, onions in plastic mesh bags, fresh herbs in plastic clamshells, individually shrink wrapped sweet potatoes or cucumbers, mushrooms that are in a foam tray with plastic film. The list goes on and on. So we wanted to figure out just how much plastic packaging is being used on fruits and vegetables at grocery stores across the country. And so this past fall and winter, our staff surveyed 40 grocery stores in 5 US cities. So San Francisco, Denver, Dallas, Richmond, Virginia, and Boston to evaluate the plastic packaging used on fresh produce. So we looked at the packaging for common produce items, including basil, broccoli, carrots, cherry tomatoes, lemons, portobello mushrooms, romaine lettuce, spinach, strawberries, and sweet potatoes. And we found that an eye-popping 81% of the surveyed produce was sold with plastic packaging, again, including plastic clamshells, plastic mesh bags, plastic film, plastic trays, and plastic twist ties. 6% of the produce that we found was sold just with a plastic produce sticker, and then 12% of surveyed produce was sold plastic free. So our survey also looked at the plastic intensity or the amount of plastic that was used in the packaging option provided for those 10 fruits and vegetables. And we found that 4 of the top 5 largest grocers by market share, Walmart, Kroger, Costco, and Amazon, were among the top 5 most plastic intensive retailers in the survey. But the good news is that our surveyors found plastic-free packaging options already available on the market, and that product lines for 9 out of the 10 produce types that we looked at were sold with no plastic at all, with the exception of strawberries. So as the challenge of plastic pollution continues to grow, grocery retailers, we think, have a real opportunity to step up and do more to reduce their use of plastic packaging. And since plastic-free options are already available for many fruits and vegetables, we think eliminating plastic in the produce aisle is low-hanging fruit for these companies. So we're working to build public support for our campaigns calling on large grocery retailers to reduce their use of plastic packaging, especially in the produce aisle. So we're going to share a link to our report and petitions to a few companies, Walmart, Trader Joe's, and Costco, asking them to use less packaging. Please feel free to sign one or all of them and make your voice heard. But I'd also encourage you to let your local grocery store know, wherever you are, that you'd like them to see them use less plastic packaging as well. So this is just one example of the kinds of corporate campaigns that we run to get companies to do what they can to reduce plastic. And we know that when we work together to build public support and then also have shareholder advocates who are working directly with the companies, we know that we can make progress. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Annie.
Great. Thanks, Celeste. This is giving me some great ideas for next year. Exciting, which is just around the corner. Our year sort of operates like on a school calendar, so kicks off over the summer, and then we are obviously wrapping up end of June here. So thank you so much for that great rundown on the problem and some solutions. Green Century's also been busy this year on the plastics front. We filed 6 plastics-related shareholder proposals at companies that we felt could do more to reduce plastic-related risks, primarily associated with their plastic packaging. We were able to withdraw all of those shareholder proposals in exchange for commitments from companies to improve their plastics-related disclosures and/or policies. So a couple of highlights I'm going to run through here. First is at Royal Caribbean. People have probably heard of this company. You can cruise all over the world, I think, or many places in the world on their cruise lines. They are the world's second largest cruise ship company, and we'd engaged them around their sustainability disclosures, particularly around plastic and just the use of plastic on those cruise ships, which are out there seeing the beautiful ocean that is unfortunately being constantly polluted by plastic. So we, after a dialogue, we ended up filing a shareholder proposal to get the company to meaningfully engage with us, which sometimes unfortunately has to happen for companies to come to the table. But they ultimately did agree to improve their sustainability closures, and specifically, they will be sharing how they plan to achieve the goal of launching a net zero cruise ship by 2035. And will also provide information on how they calculate and disclose their use of single-use plastics, which is a first key step toward ultimately reducing it. You have to know what you're doing and how much you're producing in order to figure out a plan to cut it. So that was a positive step there, and we'll continue to follow up with the company to then ultimately make a plan to reduce their plastic, which they do have a number of work streams that they're pursuing on that front. So that is positive, and we'll be continuing to work with them on that. Over to the beauty sector, Ulta Beauty, the country's largest beauty retailer, will now disclose the plastic footprint of its own brand packaging, and they also committed to setting a new sustainable packaging goal. There's way more plastic packaging in particular, than I think is needed around beauty products in general. So this is a really positive step, particularly the commitment to set a sustainable packaging goal next year. Next slide, please. Now we're hopping to the food sector. We do a lot of different, we cover a lot of different sectors in industries. So we engage with US Foods, which is one of the largest food distributors in the world, on styrofoam. So people probably are aware that polystyrene, or more commonly known as styrofoam, is a suspected human carcinogen, in addition to being really harmful to the environment. It sticks around more so than many other materials. It is there hundreds of years later. Not that we've had evidence of that, but we know that from science. So it is one of the worst types of plastic packaging or packaging that is out there. And so US Foods will be disclosing the percentage of its takeout containers made from polystyrene on the way toward ultimately phasing that out, which is a really positive step. And then last but not least, over to the toy company sector. So Mattel, people I'm sure are aware of Mattel from Barbies and many other product lines. But we pressed Mattel to provide more information on how it protects children in particular from toxic chemicals in the plastic toys themselves, in addition to plastic packaging. We ended up filing a shareholder proposal on that topic. So this is getting into the health risks of plastics a bit more. And the company subsequently disclosed shortly after we filed that it had increased the number of substances that it monitors, limits, or does not allow from 3,000 up to 15,000, which is quite significant. So that was a really positive step. We will continue to follow up with the company to make sure that more of those sort of known carcinogens, known toxins, chemicals that are known to be bad for humans are not only monitored, but phased out. And then I'll also note that I think people are fairly familiar with Costco. We've engaged Costco on a number of issues in recent years, but we did file a shareholder proposal and engage the company pretty extensively on plastic reduction a few years ago, and had filed a shareholder proposal asking the company to reduce its plastic waste. We were able to withdraw that proposal after intense negotiations that ended with the company committing to publish a 5-year plastic action plan to reduce their amount of plastic that they use. So good stuff to follow up on if you are a Costco customer, which statistically a third of Americans are. So, a third of the people on this call probably could go to your local Costco and see how they're doing on the plastic reduction front. You can also check out their sustainability reporting, but this is something that we've noted has drastically improved in the last couple of years since we engaged with them on this topic. So good news all around. We not only lock in the commitments and move on, but we also follow up with the companies that have committed to improve their policies in past years to ensure that they are following through. And Costco is a great example of that. Okay, that is the plastics update. We are now going to talk about climate change, another big focus area for Green Century, as well as for our nonprofit owners. One of the greatest threats facing our planet. So we are excited to have Johanna here to share more about Environment America's work on clean energy. Johanna, again, is the Campaign for 100% Renewable Energy Senior Director at Environment America. Thanks for joining us, Johanna.
Thank you very much, Annie. It's great to be here. Again, thank you to Green Century for creating the opportunity to share a little bit more about our campaign for 100% renewable energy. Next slide. So in this brief overview, I am going to briefly just talk about the problems associated with our dependence on dirty and dangerous energy sources. I'll walk through some of those problems at every stage of their life cycle and then explain how we define clean and renewable energy and some of the trends that we've seen in terms of clean renewable energy growing in the United States. And then I'll do a little bit of a deep dive into a product that Environment America Research and Policy Center recently released called the State of Renewable Energy Dashboard, which is an interactive dashboard that allows you to explore the growth of key clean energy technologies in each state and compare across states as well. So let me start by just diving into the problem. When it comes to energy, America is just much too dependent on energy sources that harm our land, our air, our water, and subsequently our health at every step in that energy source's journey to, from being extracted to ultimately being disposed of. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly walk through this journey, but when you think about dirty energy sources, and that can include coal, oil, gas, as well as uranium that fuels nuclear reactors, at every stage in those energy sources journeys, they pollute our air, land, and water and risk making us sick. So that journey starts with extracting the fuel from the ground. And here you can see images of mountaintop removal mining from West Virginia to extract coal out of those mountains. And this is actually a picture from the 1950s of Venice Beach, California, when there were oil rigs up and down the coast to extract oil from the coastline. So extraction harms landscapes and it pollutes, our air, land, and water. The next step in dirty energy sources is processing that fuel. And this is a picture of an oil refinery in Texas that is emitting large quantities of air pollution, which puts the health of the neighbors of that facility at risk. There are also problems associated with transporting dirty energy sources. So if we can have the next slide. Some folks on the call may remember the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was one of the largest oil spills in history. And this is a picture of a humpback whale that succumbed to the pollution after that oil spill. And then more recently, the bottom picture shows an oil train disaster that happened when a train carrying tar sands caught fire and exploded and essentially annihilated a whole town that it was passing through. Next slide, please. Then, now we're at the point of actually generating electricity and energy from those dirty energy sources. And burning coal, oil, and gas releases health-harming pollutants into the atmosphere, such as nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, and fine particulate matter that is linked to asthma and cardiovascular disease and premature death. And the combustion of burning fossil fuels is one of the largest factors that's driving global warming. So, if none of those other problems were to be acknowledged, that in and of itself is one major reason why we need to be getting off of dirty and dangerous energy sources and transitioning to renewable energy. And then last but not least, once the energy has been released from those dirty and dangerous energy sources, many of them leave behind waste that we need to deal with. And the waste transport and the disposal of waste can cause serious problems as well. This is an image of homes that were destroyed after a coal ash pond in the Tennessee Valley was flooded and the dam broke and the coal ash and the wastewater, destroyed a whole neighborhood that was nearby. So at every stage of its process, our reliance on dirty energy sources puts our health and our environment at risk. Next slide, please. Thankfully, there's a solution. America has abundant, clean, renewable energy sources. And I'm just going to walk briefly through how Environment America defines clean, renewable energy. Next slide. The first criteria is that clean renewable energy is virtually pollution-free. So it produces little to no pollution that harms our health or that causes environmental problems like climate change. The second criterion is that it's inexhaustible. So no matter how much of that energy we use, there's always going to be more. When I think about it, like we could harness all the solar energy that is around today, and the sun's still going to rise tomorrow and produce just as much energy. The third criterion is that it's safe. So clean renewable energy has virtually no impact on our environment, our safety and health, and the impacts that do occur are temporary and not permanent. And then lastly, clean renewable energy is efficient. So it's a wise and not wasteful use of our financial and environmental resources. So when you factor in all those criteria, wind and solar and geothermal are the clean renewable energy sources that rise to the surface. And what's exciting is that America has these renewable energy resources in spades. This slide comes from a research project that Environment America Research and Policy Center put out in 2001 in a report called We Have the Power. And I want to draw your attention to the small white circle outlined in red at the bottom of this graph. That visually represents how much electricity our country consumed in 2020. And all the other circles visually represent the technical potential of those renewable energy sources. So you can see here in the burnt orange circle, the technical potential of rooftop solar in the United States. And rooftop solar can't meet all of our 2020 electricity consumption, but it can meet about 45% of that. And then if you take just a little bit of offshore wind or a little bit of onshore wind or some of the vast utility scale solar PV potential that we have, you can see that it is technically feasible for the United States to meet all of its electricity needs and much more from entirely clean renewable energy sources. Next slide, please. Our strategy for growing renewable energy is detailed on this slide. So we have experienced that when we fuel this virtuous cycle, we can grow clean energy and grow public support for these technologies at the same time. And often we start this cycle by setting goals, and we structure those goals in such a way that they drive action. That action is often met with success, and then that success leads to confidence, both on the part of the public and on the part of decision makers. And then that confidence can be leveraged into the next round of ambition, which can then turn into the next wave of goals. And so we are now in America at a point where 13 states have actually committed to getting 100% of their electricity from clean energy sources. And fully 1 in 3 Americans lives in a community that's committed to 100% clean electricity. Next slide, please. Environment America plans to continue our advocacy for renewable energy. And here you can see a screenshot from our most recent product called the State of Renewable Energy, where we track the growth of 6 key clean energy technologies over the course of the past decade. And so you can see that wind generation in America has gone up dramatically. And last year, we got enough electricity from the wind to power the equivalent of 43 million homes in the United States. Solar energy, too, is on the rise. And last year, we got enough electricity from solar energy to power 36 million homes across the United States. And we've just put a link to the State of Renewable Energy dashboard in the chat, so you can take a look at how your state is doing and compare it to neighboring states. Next slide, please. The sum of this work, from the goal setting to the action that we're seeing to the confidence that is growing all across our country, has brought us to a place where 1 in 3 Americans now lives in a community committed to 100% clean renewable energy. And today, Wind and solar are among the fastest and cheapest energy sources that we can deploy to meet America's electricity needs. So I'll pause there and hand it back over to Annie.
Great. Thanks, Johanna. I always feel inspired when I listen to you talk, and both of you guys. It's like, okay, we have solutions. There are ways that we are making progress on these issues. And that is always great to hear, I think, in general, but perhaps in particular in these times. And it's a great compliment to the Green Century approach of shareholder advocacy on these issues. We have prioritized climate for many years, just given the outsized impact that it has on our planet, both now with increasing effects and then in the future if we continue on our current trajectory. So we engage pretty heavily on climate change with companies across our portfolio. We made a big impact this year on climate as well. So engaged the semiconductor sector, which, maybe you don't think about that much, but it is a powerful climate polluter. But there is progress being made. So semiconductor superpowers, Intel and Advanced Micro Devices, published plans this year to cut emissions from manufacturing and from the use of their products, which comprise more than 90% of their overall climate footprint. So this is pretty significant. Sometimes you'll see companies putting out climate targets for or climate emissions reduction targets for the emissions from their buildings or what's called scope 1 and 2 emissions. So emissions that are pretty close to home that they have direct control over. And that is good, and that is a key first step, but it can be a lot more challenging and therefore more rare, frankly, for companies to come out with scope 3 emissions reduction targets and plans. So scope 3 emissions are emissions from a company's supply chain. Depending on the sector, they often comprise a significant chunk of a given company's emissions, up to 98 or 9% in some cases, particularly for food companies. But even from the semiconductor industry, the scope 3 or these supply chain emissions, which include use of their products, comprise about 90% of the company's overall emissions, and they're harder to tackle. They're really complicated, but it's pretty significant then that these companies have managed not only to to measure their emissions, of their supply chain emissions, set targets, and then come out with a plan to actually hit those targets. That's notable and really sets the bar and sets the standard for other companies in that sector. So these climate transition plans, as we call them, came out this year after these companies committed to putting out these plans in a withdrawal agreement with Green Century last year and the year before. So good to see again those commitments bearing fruit, those policies that were committed to, and those practices that companies say they're going to undertake actually happening and being followed through with. So good stuff there. I'll also note that AGCO, this is another what we call implementation victory, or a company that follows through on the commitment. And again, companies actually largely do follow through on their commitments, which is good news. AGCO is one of the largest farm equipment manufacturers in the world. They put out their climate roadmap or their climate transition plan this year as well. And it outlined new renewable energy projects that will reduce emissions for the company, equivalent to taking over 23,000 cars off the road for a year. So pretty significant there, and great to see that reliance on an investment in clean renewable energy. Next slide, a couple of specific victories from this year. So we had, I think, 9 climate proposals go to a vote this year. And one of them was at a shipping company called ArcBest. And the vote was 30%, which is actually quite strong. So just for context, not many votes come in over a majority these days. And 30% is a very strong indication to management that a good chunk of shareholders, a large percentage of the company's investors really do think this is an issue that the company needs to deal with and address meaningfully and fulsomely, significantly more so than it is currently doing. So that was a great vote and something that we'll be following up with ArcBest on going forward, as the company was pretty significantly lagging their peers. Columbia Sportswear in Celeste's hometown in Portland, Oregon. People know Columbia Sportswear, I imagine, probably from the vests and the zip ups and all the gear. but a company that certainly has a sustainability-oriented image, right? Like this is a company people think of and think, oh, they get people outside. They must also surely protect that outside that they are helping people get out into to enjoy. In our engagements with the company, we found they had a lot of work to do in terms of their climate impact and leaning into the renewable energy sourcing. So we filed a shareholder proposal there and were ultimately able to withdraw it in exchange for the company pledging to increase the solar power that they source and the energy efficiency levels across more than 1 million square feet of their owned and operated locations, primarily again out there in Oregon. So really good steps forward in the right direction for Columbia. And then at Chubb, this is one of the largest insurance companies in the world. That they, after we've engaged with Chubb for many years, but and usually the proposals have gone to a vote or the company has challenged them and they've been thrown out. This year, and this actually gets to a question that's coming up at the Q&A, so I'll circle back to sort of how companies have been engaging this year versus last year. But this year, Chubb did come to the negotiating table with us after we filed our proposal, and they ultimately agreed to disclose how the company influences governmental climate policies, and will share those details in its next sustainability report. So this is getting into an issue that I think we may do more in next year, which is climate-aligned lobbying, responsible political engagement that companies do or don't do. It's definitely something that I think investors are interested in seeing more details on, the degree to which or how and how much money companies invest in or pour into lobbying and political engagement, and whether or not those activities are aligned with the company's own policies on, say, climate change or nature protection is a very important question that I think companies need to start answering for investors. So Chubb, fortunately, will be doing that in its next sustainability report on climate, so you can look out for that. Next slide, please. We also work on a variety of other issues. So we have done a lot of work over the years on forest protection. We also work on conservation, right to repair, and sustainable agriculture, among others, and have had some significant victories this year on those issues as well. So I'll just highlight a couple here before we open it up to Q&A. I do want to highlight a victory we had with Bank of America this year. So after 2 years of engagement here, actually, the Bank of America released new forest protection standards that effectively require its clients operating in beef, soy, palm oil, and forestry sectors to have or be pursuing deforestation-free operations and supply chains. That is very significant. Bank of America is the second largest bank in the US, sixth largest in the world, and a lot of its peers already had these standards saying, all right, we're not going to finance companies that are effectively engaged in deforestation. Bank of America did not have anything like that. So after 2 years of engagement and ultimately a shareholder proposal, we were able to withdraw it in exchange for the company actually putting those policies out there in its public disclosures saying it will not finance deforestation. Chemours. People may have heard of Chemours, but perhaps if not, you've probably heard of DuPont Chemical. So Chemours is a DuPont spinoff. This is a company that sort of a chemical company with a lot of different arms, but one of them is mining, and they operate a number of titanium mines to ultimately create titanium dioxide, which is a whitener used in everything from toothpaste to sunscreen to white paint, probably Oreos. Don't fact check me on that one, but it's a whitener. And there's been some concern locally near the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia that the company was considering buying or otherwise engaging in mining operations right next to the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge, which when you think about it, we shouldn't be destroying wildlife habitat for our toothpaste whitener. Like that just is absurd. So we engaged Chemours, asked them to improve their biodiversity policies and the strategies they use to protect biodiversity around their mining locations. So they did, in fact, agree to improve those efforts, strengthen protections for biodiversity, which will hopefully make it untenable for them in the future to mine near the Okefenokee. Next slide, please. Right to repair. This is one of my favorite issues. I'd love to do like a hand raised poll thing. I don't know that will really work here, but just to see who's heard of right to repair and if this is an issue that is on the radar screens of the people in the audience here. But right to repair is essentially the idea that we as consumers should be able to fix our own stuff. We should be able to fix the stuff that we own. And so the right to repair effort, it's a set of campaigns being run primarily by our sort of nonprofit owners, they're called the PIRGs, the public interest research groups. They are working to make sure that people have the information, the tools, and the parts available that can help them fix their own stuff. Sounds like we're getting a lot of claps, a lot of thumbs up. Great. Okay, thanks for that informal poll. But right to repair is a really important issue, right? We should be able to fix the stuff we own. To say otherwise is absurd. Unfortunately, there's this thing called planned obsolescence, where in a lot of cases, companies make things that are designed not to last. So we engage with companies across sectors. Primarily, tech companies have historically been the type of companies we've engaged with on this topic, but we engaged Whirlpool this year, and pressed them to make it easier for people to access repair manuals, which would allow users to fix their own appliances and essentially have repairs done by independent repair shops or themselves, instead of having to toss out the whole dishwasher and buy a new one. Anyway, so this move, along with the other great efforts from the folks at iFixit and PIRG and other people working on Right to Repair, will not only save people money because they'll be able to hang on to their stuff longer, but it also will significantly reduce electronic waste, which ranks as one of the fastest growing solid waste streams in the world. So significant there, and excited to do more on that next year. And I'll wrap up here with PepsiCo and McDonald's. So people know these companies. Yes. McDonald's, we engage McDonald's on regenerative agriculture. So a type of sustainable agriculture covers a lot of different types of policies that essentially are just better for climate and nature when engaging in agriculture. It can involve crop rotation, planting cover crops, certain grazing techniques. McDonald's had some commitments around dollars spent and acres that it would implement regenerative agricultural policies on, but it didn't have information about what outcomes those policies or those investments were leading to. So it's all well and good to talk a good talk about regenerative agriculture, but unless you are actually then disclosing the impacts or the improvements or the outcomes, it is talk. And so we were able to engage McDonald's on this and withdraw our shareholder proposal in exchange for the company disclosing more information about how it uses those regenerative agriculture practices and then what outcomes those investments have led to. And then PepsiCo will now publicly describe its process for reducing its impacts on nature, including biodiversity loss, climate change, and water scarcity, by supporting regenerative agriculture, ecosystem protection and restoration, as well as sourcing that doesn't destroy forests. So some good progress on biodiversity there. And this was after a 3-year engagement with PepsiCo. This was our 3rd filing in a row. And this year we were able to come to a withdrawal agreement with the company on those issues. Okay, I'm going to stop talking here because I think we have a number of questions in the chat. And this was, I'll just say sort of in sum, this was a really productive year. And frankly, going into it, we weren't necessarily expecting that. This political climate is challenging in many ways, and we were somewhat concerned that we might not be able to file shareholder proposals, or that shareholder rights would be otherwise curtailed in any number of ways, and to some extent they have been. But the ability to file proposals and meaningfully engage companies on these topics is still intact, and somewhat to our surprise. We've been able to have really productive conversations and engagements this year, arguably even more so than last year. It was a really positive sign that these issues matter, regardless of the noise. The companies are acting on them, and they are continuing to do so, no matter which way the political winds are blowing.
Thanks so much, Annie. We'll move to questions in a second, but first let's hang on this slide for a second. The QR code on the left will take you to a fact sheet, a 2-page fact sheet that summarizes a lot of the content that we went through on today's call. So that's a good one for your own use and for sharing with others. And for those of you that are not already subscribed to Green Century's newsletter, the QR code on the right it will take you to that. We can move to the next slide while we show you this required slide. I'll remind you to be on the lookout for an email that will provide a link to the presentation deck that we used today, as well as links to several of the resources that it came up through the presentation. So the petitions that Celeste talked about in her section, the dashboard for renewable energy that Johanna talked about in her section. So be on the lookout for that email, as it will be chock full of summary information. Okay, so then without further ado, we'll get to some questions from all of you. The first one that we have is for Annie, and you touched on this a little bit already, but can you sort of fill in some color on how companies are responding this year as compared to previous years? Like what's different? And then a little more on what you were just talking about, like what's surprising to you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I'll just say, companies this year, were actually, we were able to engage more companies in substantive dialogue this year, actually, and more of them were interested in coming to the table to negotiate withdrawal of our shareholder proposals in exchange for commitments. I think there's been some developments at the SEC that have heightened legal risk and reputational risk for companies who might want to not bring our proposal before their investors. They were previously able to challenge proposals and have the SEC then weigh in on whether or not they had a good enough argument to toss out a shareholder's proposal. The SEC removed itself from that process this year, so there's just a lot of uncertainty, and companies, I think, were largely not wanting to deal with that. And so we're instead saying, all right, let's just see if we can negotiate something here. So I'd say, and that's held true for others who file a lot of proposals in our field. Companies were surprisingly a little bit more willing to speak with us and to negotiate withdrawals. I would say also broadly, companies are still mostly doing the work here. And that's been great to understand. I think there's been less disclosure, unfortunately. There's been a lot of walk back. It's not super widespread, but it is the case that some companies are not necessarily scrubbing certain words from their disclosures, but they're just disclosing less. And I think that's largely a risk management measure. And so to some extent, we understand that. But we've been working with companies to still disclose significant sustainability information that is decision useful to investors that we want and need to see to understand how they're managing environmental risks. So I think that's been more the conversation, but it's been really, inspiring is a strong word, but it has been good to know that companies are actually largely still chugging forward.
Great. Okay, we're going to pivot over to Johanna, and I'm actually going to ask you two questions that have come up in the chat. The first is related to data centers. What do we do about those? How does that factor into your work? And then Annie, also to you, what's Green Century doing about data centers? So let's do that one first, and then I've got another question for Johanna after that.
Great, thanks. For everybody who works in the clean, green, renewable energy space, data centers are a huge concern because after close to 2 decades of relatively flat electricity demand in the United States, thanks in part to electricity demand from data centers, those projections are now going up. And I just put a link in the chat to an article that Environment America put out last month that just really details how our transition to clean renewable energy is at risk because of this projected demand in data center electricity usage. The United States had been on track to essentially being coal-free by 2040-ish. And because the lives of some of our dirtiest coal-fired power plants and gas plants are being extended, at the current rate, America isn't going to be coal-free until 2065, which is far outside of the bounds of what science tells us we need to be doing in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change. So we have a multi-factor strategy to dealing with data centers, both from helping local communities organize to challenge data centers in their communities and ask hard questions about the water impacts and the electricity impacts and the open space impacts of these facilities locally. And then we're also running some corporate campaigns, for example, urging Google and Microsoft to keep their clean energy pledges and make sure that data centers that they do use run on clean renewable energy, disclose their energy and water usage, and as much as possible, incorporate energy efficient technologies so that the energy use from that sector is as minimal as we can make it.
Okay. And so then let's pivot to Annie on Green Century's work on data centers.
Really briefly, because I know there are a lot of questions. We are following this issue really closely, and I think we're going to be engaging a lot more deeply next year. But we are sort of on a bunch of conversations, both online and webinars, and learning more about the issue. And there's obviously serious concerns from an energy use perspective and climate perspective, and as well as water risk. So we'll be engaging deeply next year. Stay tuned.
Great. Okay, then the second question for Johanna is around negative impacts associated with renewable energy. We had a couple of questions related to that. So
I love this question. Thank you for asking it. So we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that every energy source has an environmental impact, including wind and solar, right? Because to build the wind turbines, you need steel and fiberglass, and that requires resources. To build the solar panels, you need to turn sand into glass, and it requires aluminum and other, heavy metals in order to do the electrical components of the solar panels. That being said, we know that harnessing clean renewable energy via wind turbines and solar panels has much less of an environmental footprint than our continued reliance on dirty and dangerous sources of energy like coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. And so our approach is, first, we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that every energy use has an impact. And so the cleanest energy is the energy we never use in the first place. That's part of why Environment America emphasizes energy efficiency and conservation in our advocacy, and really says that efficiency and conservation should be the first fuel we turn to. And you might be staggered. I was staggered to learn when I found out that roughly 2/3 of the energy that we produce in America never gets put to any kind of practical use. 2/3 gets wasted, most of it just in the form of heat at the point of power generation. So there are huge opportunities to just make our energy system more efficient. So, and if we do that, then it's going to be that much easier to meet all of our electricity demand with clean renewable sources like wind and solar. That being said, I do think it's important to acknowledge that even though you might have to mine the critical minerals for solar panels, the sunshine, the fuel, shows up for free every day and doesn't pollute. So if you think about like the analogy is like the solar panel is like the power plant, the sunshine shows up for free every day and is pollution free, whereas the coal to fuel the power plant has to be mined, transported, burned, and then has ash that needs to be disposed of. And that's where you see the biggest environmental benefits of clean renewables just trumping the incumbent dirty energy sources of the past, because the fuel is clean and renewable.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we've got time for 2 more questions. Quick hit. Celeste, the first one to you, and then Annie to wrap things up. For Celeste, I'm concerned about plastics. Can you give a summary of what you found in the plastics in the produce aisle report? Are there stores that we should avoid?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I will attempt to answer this quickly. Yeah, we found that there was a lot of plastic in the produce aisle. 81% of the plastic items that we surveyed were packaged in plastic. Interestingly, there wasn't a huge variation between companies. The grocery industry in general, I think, was pretty similar across the board. And so I would just encourage you to not necessarily avoid buying fruits and vegetables, because those are obviously healthy, but instead make your voice heard with your local grocery store and just let them know that you'd like to have more options when shopping for your fruits and vegetables. And then also, as consumers, we have a lot of power both in advocating for the changes we want, but also in how we spend our dollars. So definitely go for the plastic-free options as much as possible to also indicate to the grocery stores that you'd rather have lemons that aren't packaged in plastic.
Excellent. And then Annie, last question to you. Looking ahead, how are you approaching next shareholder season? Any trends or themes you're anticipating?
Well, I can't give away our secrets, so I won't say too much here. But yes, it's a really exciting time, I think, to be working on these issues, to be a person involved in both politics and advocacy, and just a person who can also vote with their dollar, both at companies and with their investments. Um, I expect more on data centers for sure. So I think, again, we'll be doing more on that. That's a really hot button issue and increasingly so and in this country. And then I think that nature risk in its various forms will continue to be a big focus for investors and for companies as we gain a greater understanding of all the ways that corporate activity harms nature and drives biodiversity loss and nature loss, which is critical to not only the ability to run a business, but also life on Earth. So those are just a couple of thoughts as we head into the next season. But our planning meetings for Green Century are tomorrow and Thursday for the advocacy team. So that could totally change. But I think those will be some themes, and I think there's a lot of impact to be made and a lot of positive, hopeful trends to look forward to seeing how they play out.
Well, great. Thank you for that, Annie, and to Johanna and Celeste for joining us today. And most important, all of our investors and prospective investors that took the time to come and join our webinar. It's always good when we can end a webinar with a "We're Protecting Life on Earth" type response. And as we noted, we'll have follow-up materials, and you can expect to receive those in the next couple of days. So thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.